So before I introduce our speaker tonight, and wanted to give, since I didn't start the camera at the right time, tonight's speaker is Lee Lawrence, and he's speaking on the signs and symptoms of spiritual awakening. So what we like to do is a quick little centering before we bring Lee on. So if you'll just take a moment and kind of gently close your eyes, and we're going to do 3 quick breaths and get relaxed. So on our first breath, we'll breathe in love and light, and when we breathe out any stress issues that we might have today, and just let them go, let them float away. And on our second breath, we can bring in more love and light, and we can bring in some relaxation right into our hearts, and breathe out whatever remains, any remaining things from the day. And lastly, we're going to bring in one last breath for concentration and our focus. Breathe in and focus our attention and our love on tonight's presentation by Lee Lawrence. So in tonight's presentation, Lee's, I'm glad you're back. Thanks for joining me for that brief breath relaxation. And wanted to let you know about Lee Lawrence tonight. He's our speaker. He'll help us to understand the signs and symptoms that can be associated with spiritual awakening, why they exist, and also his techniques to resolve those issues and set us free. As a part of his talk, Lee is going to present a roadmap and the soul growth of the related experiences encountered when you're growing through dependent and codependent relationships on a path to self-actualization. He's going to shed light on the patterns encountered with midlife crisis and the diminishing of the self into transcendence, which he affirms is the ultimate goal and the reason for being in the physical bodies. Lee has been a presenter for many years for various topics, including science of the soul, anatomy and physiology of the human soul, and his near-death experience. He has traveled the world presenting at universities, conferences, and churches on various aspects of consciousness experience during spiritual awakening. And his presentations bring all religions together with a higher level of understanding of the human soul. So for more than 30 years, Lee's been known as the Kundalini therapist, as he assists people who encounter difficulties during the spiritual and Kundalini awakening. So he's referred to as a mystic man, the man who reads souls, and I can attest to that personally. I've had that experience with Lee. So for tonight, we're going to present in a couple of stages. Lee will present till around 8:30, at which time we'll take a short break, bio break, just to kind of stretch your legs, come back in about 8 minutes, and then we'll do some question and answer. And the question and answer of Spiritual Frontiers Fellowship is one of the unique parts of our presentations, is that you are interactive with the speaker of the evening. And we usually do most of that during the end of it, but Lee is welcome to entertain questions along the way. So if you could raise your hand and or text me with your question, and if I can share it with him during, at an opportune time of his presentation, I'll do that. Does that sound good, Lee?
Sounds excellent.
Okay, so I'm going to get Lee here. Want to introduce you to Lee Lawrence and his presentation tonight. Take it away, Lee.
Thank you, Smith. I don't get to see who is here, but I imagine there are a lot of familiar faces. I put my email address up on the screen, and I'm laughing because I noticed that my screen is in reverse and my email is in reverse. So I think I need to fix that right away. And please, everyone, mute your microphones. And because otherwise it'll keep switching back and forth if anyone makes a little bit of sound or there's sound in the room. And if you have questions, you can actually ask questions along the way in chat, and Smith is going to monitor the chat and let me know if there's questions. I'm just looking for how to not reverse my background. Let's see.
The background looks
It's not
good.
reversed.
I think I got it. Okay. Now you can read my email on there, which is just Lee, middle initial S, Lawrence@gmail.com. That is really weird. The screen is reversed, but not the text. It's going to take me a while to figure that out. Again, Smith, if you want to mute everyone's microphones, and that way it'll stop the interruptions. I decided not to do a PowerPoint because I want to make this more interactive and allow people to connect to what I'm saying and stay out of their left brain and follow this with feeling as we're going through it, rather than what I found is when I'm using the PowerPoint, people switch back and forth, left brain, left brain, right brain, and people get overloaded so fast. A lot of the concepts that I'm going to be presenting today, no one has ever put them in writing in a book. Even in the sacred texts, they allude to some of what I'm about to tell you, but nowhere do they describe it in the detail that I'm going to describe it today. And everything that I'm describing to you and explaining to you 100% is based upon my own personal experiences and observations. It's not based upon reading what everybody else's theories and what everyone else says. So, first of all, what is spiritual awakening? What is happening? In 1988, I had meningitis and I died. And when I died, I left my body and I went through what's referred to as the portal, or some people call it the tunnel with the light at the other end. You know, while we're still in our physical body, it's a train coming at us. But when we die, that light is actually the light of higher consciousness in what we refer to as heaven. So the portal is an opening through what's called the bardo, or a layer of darkness. And that layer of darkness, when people die, they have to go through that layer of darkness to get to the lighter, higher consciousness on the other side. And the reason for this is it acts as an etheric fence. It keeps souls out of the higher consciousness that are not supposed to be there, number one. But also, more importantly, it blocks the light of heaven from shining down onto earth. Because if the light of heaven shone down on earth, we would not be able to experience the duality that's necessary for life in these physical bodies. So what is the purpose of life in these physical bodies? We're souls. And the physical body is just the vehicle or the forum that gives us the experiences that are necessary for our soul to grow. So what actually happens in an awakening process is, you know, we've all heard the saying, I'm not a physical body having a spiritual, or a human having a spiritual experience. I'm a spiritual being having a a human experience. Well, that is very, very true, because it is your soul that is perpetual. Nothing can kill your soul. When you die, you leave your body and you actually move. Most people move on to the next level. What I'm giving tonight is a summary, and there's a lot of topics that I might mention, but I'll stay away from, such as a lot of people, when they leave their physical body, because they're hanging on to anger or guilt or fear or low frequency thoughts that act as anchors or ballast, they can't raise to the higher level, and they get stuck here on earth as ghosts, or many times they attach to other people. The process for me was, when I popped out in heaven, it was as though I popped out of a fire, like there was a campfire, and it had all this light, and I popped out, and there were 4 golden beings. Now, when people talk about they see people they know, or they see other beings, a being that is not in a physical body can actually show itself to you in any appearance that it desires to. So when you see loved ones, their souls are there, and they can present themselves in whatever way you expect to see them, which incidentally, all of your thoughts are public. There is no such thing as a private thought. Well, when I popped into heaven, and these 4 very large golden beings, they were egg-shaped, golden like orbs, and I asked them for help. But instead of them answering me, they leaned back and started praying, and it shot me up to another layer of heaven. Now, there's many, many layers, but they work in octaves. So even the lower heaven has many, many octaves, and then you can move from that octave to a higher heaven. At that higher level, the higher you go, there's 2 attributes that you find. Number 1, the stronger the love. So as you go higher, the bliss is beyond words. The second thing is the light gets brighter the higher you go. So in different sacred scriptures, when they say God is love and light, that is merely an attribute of higher consciousness. So let's address a couple concepts. First of all, the concept of God. I use my own personal definition. I do not impose it on anyone. You're welcome to use it if you choose, but my definition of God is any level of consciousness that exists above the level that I'm at. What you find is that religions, plural, are just theories and philosophies of the anatomy and physiology of the human soul and how it interacts with its environment. Because the human soul's physical to me, what I'm describing to you is a higher level of understanding that brings all these different religions together without discounting. For the most part, the individual religions are correct, but they're incomplete. So rather than a theory and a philosophy about the human soul, I'm explaining to you, here's how the physical soul works. You say, well, why is it physical to you? Your perception of reality is a function of the frequency of consciousness from which you view it. So what happens is, in the mystics, as consciousness raises in frequency and it expands, you start to perceive things that other people cannot perceive. And while some people have certain attributes, pieces of this, while they're still in a physical body, it doesn't fully manifest until you transcend self. So I'm going to walk you through the developmental sequence, but I have a couple of things that are important concepts to cover first. When I went to heaven, and when I went to the higher level, I don't know why, but I asked for help. And the message came back, it is time. And I was given a lot of visions, and I was able to see a lot of things that were unfolding in the future of the earth. And as I'm seeing these in the early 90s, I'm sure that they're going to unfold in the mid 90s, like 94, 95. But at the time I was a hermit and I didn't say anything to anyone. I just kind of was watching what was unfolding. Well, there's a time distortion. The time distortion, what I thought was going to be a year or two, ended up being over 30 years, and those things are happening right now. So some of what I'm sharing with you, do not allow fear to come in. Fear is the biggest obstacle to spiritual growth. Perfect love casts out fear. Divine love is different than human love. Divine love is unconditional and freeing. It lifts you up. Where human love is conditional and controlling. So when I talk about love, I'm talking about divine love, not about human love that lifts you up. So just as, when Jesus was asked, what were the most important commandments? He said, number one, love God. I paraphrase that to say, that means strive to raise your consciousness to the highest level possible. In other words, make your soul become one with that higher level of consciousness that we refer to as God. The second commandment, which was love thy neighbor as thyself, I actually prefer the way the Sufi poet Rumi worded that, which is life is about finding and removing the obstacles to love that exist in your soul. Now, what I'm going to show you is a diagram, and I'll show you exactly where these, I define sin as any obstacle to love in the soul. I don't use the word sin. I just call it an obstacle to love. So whether it be fear, anger, guilt, whatever it is, that is a cloud of consciousness that is very dense. And because it's dense, it creates a bubble in your soul where love can't exist. Why is love so critically important? Because love is the glue that holds your soul together. Your soul consists of two fields, as long as you're in duality. Those two fields are your masculine and feminine aspect. And I'll show you in a diagram in a little bit. They spin in different directions. Love is what attaches to both of those and stabilizes them. Without love, your consciousness can't grow to higher levels. This is why if we have an early childhood trauma, it affects love at the, not just the security level, not just at the sexual level, not just at the self-identity level, but in every level of consciousness that exists in our soul. Again, don't become fearful based upon what I'm about to say. We're headed into a lot of turmoil, and this turmoil is coming in two stages. The first stage is the turmoil that you're seeing unfolding right now. The economic, the political, the military, the whole world currency situation. you're seeing people, and this is what I was shown in the visions, people become very fearful. And what that fearful does is it causes them to shift their consciousness into the emotional and out of their logical left brain. And that's what I was shown, was that people will get very irrational and they'll lose their logical discernment. Politically, I'm an observer. I joke I'm apolitical, and the A stands for antagonist. I pick on both sides. I antagonize both sides. What happens is there has to be a coming together. There has to be a middle road that brings peace. And the only way that we can move into that middle road is for people to have increased understanding and rise to a higher level of consciousness. So the first part of the turmoil has one function. From a higher level, it's a very good thing. It's crushing people's ego bubbles. Because as long as people are full of themselves, they have no room for higher consciousness. They have no room for the divine. So what is happening is we are coming into a period of tribulation, which is going to crush people's sense of self, their self-power. While I refer to the Christian scriptures a lot, it's because I grew up Christian and I know those better, but I'm just as much Buddhist as I am Christian. I'm just as much Islamic, Muslim as I am Hindu, as I am Jewish, as I am Christian, because they're all teaching the same things. When I lay out the developmental pattern, you're going to see how the different religions fit in. For example, in Christianity, they talk about dying daily. In Buddhism, they call that same thing achieving no self, or the empty self. Dying daily is not physically dying, it's ego death, which incidentally, I do a fair amount of hospice work and caring for people right before they die. And a lot of times, sometimes it's only a couple hours, sometimes it's a couple days before death. There's what I refer to as the pre-death agitation phase. And what it is, it's an ego rebellion. It's an ego death. And people who were the nicest, gentlest, calmest person their entire life will be belligerent and bossy. And it's the ego fearing, I'm going to be destroyed. This person's leaving their body. So it throws a temper tantrum. After that ego death, people start to hear their loved ones. They start to see their loved ones. I've had people see their pets come to them, and they start to perceive the light. What we as human beings need to do is to learn how to move that pre-death agitation phase, that ego death, to very early in our life. Because after that, a person, peace, contentment, no fear. So in this process, when I'm talking about a midlife crisis, what you'll find is that that is the process of ego death. On that time distortion, time is not just a function of the speed of light. You know, they say when you look at a star, you're looking at a star that's so many light years away, meaning that light left that star so many years ago in order to arrive at the Earth today. So we've always considered time as a function of the speed of light. However, there's one variable that Einstein, he alluded to it, but he forgot it in his equation. Time is a function of your frequency of consciousness divided by the speed of light. So that as you grow spiritually and your consciousness increases in frequency, time seems to accelerate. I joke, life is like a roll of toilet paper. The closer you get to the end, the faster it goes. Many people who are in their latter years will tell you that weeks go by as though they're days, hours go by as days. It just flies by. Time flies by so fast. The other thing that happens as your soul grows, it expands. But it can't expand beyond the physical body until you first achieve wholeness. What is wholeness? Wholeness is where your consciousness in both masculine and feminine aspects have merged together at each level. Relationships are where we are using other people's physical bodies or souls as a crutch for the aspect of consciousness that we deny in ourselves. Now, part of what I was shown back in the late 80s was the earth changes that are happening. In the early 90s, I was explaining to people how the earth, the core, was going to change. About 2 months ago, scientists discovered that the core of the earth actually reversed. Now, what is happening is, as above, so below. As long as the earth had a strong dipolar field, a strong North Pole and a South Pole, human souls on the earth were shackled to that polarity of the earth, and they didn't grow. As a result of that field weakening, we're in the springtime of soul growth. Souls are growing faster than ever. So if souls are growing towards wholeness, and men have to experience their feminine, and females have to experience their masculine to become whole, all of a sudden you can say, oh, that's why we're having the great increase in the last 50 years of the gay and lesbian population, and now the trans population. Because as I'll show you in a diagram, your gender identity is totally a function of which aspect of consciousness is dominant. So when I stick my hand out and I feel a memory stored in a person's soul, if it has more left spin, I'll know it was a masculine memory. If it has more right spin, I'll know it was a feminine memory. Each of these are anchored back into the body in different ways. So what is happening is higher consciousness is coming to Earth right now. What we refer to as the bardo, or that layer of darkness, is getting thinner and thinner. And higher consciousness is coming to Earth. Call it the Holy Spirit, call it the Great White Spirit to the Native Americans, whatever you call it, doesn't matter. It's higher consciousness. And you might think, oh boy, that's wonderful, except for one thing. Remember the parable of not putting new wine in an old wineskin, not patching old garments with new cloth? You have to get rid of the old in order to bring in the new. So what is happening right now is this first part of turmoil is part of a cleansing process that is forcing people to let go. Now, as a result of soul growth and this journey towards wholeness, this is the whole reason in the last, since the 1950s, divorce rate has skyrocketed, because souls are growing at different rates. Your partner might be your complement at one level of consciousness, and 5 years later, you may have grown and your partner did. This is the reason why the divorce rate is so high. At the same time, it's the reason for equal rights and civil rights. And these are all attributes in society of soul growing. We're in the springtime of soul growth, and it's absolutely wonderful. Uncomfortable, but wonderful. The soul growth, I love working with atheists because they have no preconceived notion of God. One of the problems is that when we have a preconceived notion of God, one of the very first things that we apply to it is judgment. We should behave this way, and we are judged if we do not. And while there are certain characteristics of soul growth that are necessary, such as life is precious. Now, while death is still just a learning experience for the soul, it's not the end. Life is precious because it's the forum where you get the experiences for your soul to grow. Again, I don't judge people who have taken their life for whatever reason. I enjoy working with Buddhists because as they're going through the darkness and they get suicidal, my first comment is, well, you've worked your entire life to get to this point where you're facing this difficult experience that you need to go through in order to learn. You can either buckle up, go through it right now, or you can come back the next time and live your entire life only to be right at this same exact spot again. Bottom line is, we need to move forward through our difficult situations, no matter how difficult they are. I talk about death as more of a semester break than it is a graduation. Because if a soul dies and they have not become whole, if they have not transcended self, then they haven't graduated yet. Graduation is transcendence. When you transcend self, you begin to see, feel, hear, taste, smell, all five senses directly from your consciousness. People have talked about in near-death experiences, they were born blind and blind their entire life, but in their near-death experience, they could see. When you raise your consciousness to a high enough frequency, you learn to perceive directly from your consciousness. That's how I read souls. It's not because I studied and meditated for years and did something. My abilities are in spite of me, not because of me. By no means am I anyone special. It's just that when I died and experienced that strong love, it transformed my soul. A couple other important things that in the duality, we have masculine consciousness in our soul that spins to the left, the feminine to the right. The masculine consciousness is the inflow of consciousness into our soul. The feminine consciousness is the outflow. If you have a lamp and you plug a lamp into the wall, it's got two prongs. One prong is the light coming from the power company through your meter and through your electrical system into your house, and that flows into the light bulb. But your light will not light without the second prong, which all that is, it's a wire that goes back into your breaker panel, and to there it connects to a copper wire that's connected to a copper rod that's driven into the earth. So in essence, your light, your lamp will not light unless you have the inflow from the power company and the outflow into the earth or the grounding. Human soul works the same way. When people meditate for years, what happens is they tap into those higher levels of consciousness, which are a higher voltage. That's what actually increases their frequencies of consciousness, is tapping into the higher voltage. Let's think of it as spark plug in a car. If you have a spark plug and you have a 12-volt battery in your car, and you have a wire that comes through your coil and your distributor, and it goes to that spark plug. And each time your cylinder on your car fires, there has to be a spark that jumps across and ignites your gas. A neuron in the brain works that same way. It's actually an inflow of the energy, and then at the axon hillock on that neuron, it has a spark that sends that nerve impulse through the neuron. That's the inflow and the outflow. Masculine energy is inflow, feminine energy is outflow. Now in 2001, I was picking up a degree in psychology because I wanted to understand these experiences that I was having. Well, guess what? It didn't help much. But as part of that process, I was in the psych research lab and I put on the headgear and was hooked to an EEG. And I had never done this before. And I decided while I'm looking at the screen that I'm going to meditate. And all of a sudden, it flatlined. And two professors came over and said, something's wrong with that machine. Move to a different machine and try it there. And the same thing happened. That's because I didn't understand the gamma frequency of consciousness, or the mystical higher frequencies. Now, the Dalai Lama's sent 10 of his monks to the University of Wisconsin for EEGs. And they reached very high frequency or gamma frequency. However, their EEG was like this, very high amplitude waves, but also a high frequency, where mine had virtually no amplitude. If you looked at it really close, you could see there was little jagged edges like a hacksaw blade, very small oscillations. So it took me quite a few years to try and figure out, why was my gamma frequency low amplitude where the Dalai Lama's monks was high amplitude? Those monks are not allowed to touch women. They are separated, and they meditated for 30 or 40 years, which, remember what I said earlier, that's reaching into the higher masculine. So what happened was their gap in their soul between their masculine and feminine was very high. So what that meant was, think of the amplitude of the EEG wave as actually measuring the amount of gap that that spark has to jump, or the action potential from the masculine to the feminine. When I died and went to heaven, and the love was so strong, it actually brought my masculine and feminine consciousness together into an androgyny form, which meant that that gap that it had to jump was very low. So what happened to me, and the reason why I'm able to do a lot of these things that even the monks can't do, is because my consciousness reaches that higher frequency while I'm in a normal awakened state. I don't have to set down. Let's go back to the example of the spark plug in the car. A 12-volt battery is not sufficient to create a spark to jump across that spark plug and ignite the gas. So they put in a coil. A coil steps up the voltage. That's why if you ever grabbed a hold of a spark plug wire, it'll zap you. But if you touch the battery, it doesn't zap you because that's only 12 volt. What happens is by meditating and tapping into higher consciousness, it does to your soul's consciousness exactly what that coil does to the electrical system on the car. So if you think of that spark plug, it's got a rubber wire that comes to the top of it. That's the inflow. And the bottom of it is mounted into the engine block, which is the ground. I'm using this as an example. So what happens is, as you put your pedal down on the gas pedal, your foot down on the gas pedal, and the engine starts running faster, now there's faster sparks going through those spark plug wires and it's firing faster. That same thing happens to the human brain and within the soul. And in this developmental process of the soul, your soul starts out, and I'll show you this on the developmental line in a little bit. It starts off in the delta frequency from conception up to about age 2, very, very low hertz. It then goes into the theta frequency. That's the emotional child. That programs up till about age 8. Roughly age 8, roughly 4th grade. You ever notice how children change in 4th grade, especially the boys? They're mama's boys at the beginning of the year, and by the end of the year, they're these tough, rebellious. That's because that is the age in normal development where children begin to switch from the feminine emotional child to the logical sense of self. The ego is actually masculine. What happens is we start off with our soul growth in the emotional aspect. If we encounter a trauma, we actually shift prematurely from that emotional child into a premature logical sense of self. These are your 7-year-olds going on 35. They have a perception of reality that is way beyond their years. However, they also have a ticking time bomb of emotional trauma that they ran from and escaped in order to formulate that sense of self. So what happens then is we then go on and self-actuate. Now, the ego is not bad. We talk about we have to crush the ego, we have to destroy the ego. Well, guess what? You can't do that until you form an ego. Why is forming an ego so important? Because you cannot surrender your consciousness to a higher level if somebody else has control of it. Your codependencies and dependencies that are locking people into their emotions, that are blocking them from finding their ego self and self-actuating, is blocking soul growth. You have to take your power from other people and own it yourself. Only then can you go through a midlife crisis and go through the dark night of the soul and actually surrender your consciousness to a higher level within you. If you do not own your will, if somebody else owns it, you're going to get stuck generally in a cycle of depression. As you keep going back, life will bring your issues to the surface, and it'll keep taking you back and giving you opportunities to try and resolve that trauma that's holding you back.
Hey, Lee, can I ask a quick question?
Please do.
Yes, we had one attendee here, Katie. Can you expand on what it means to transcend the self, and how can that best be done intentionally?
Well, the first step before you can transcend self is you have to achieve wholeness. Wholeness takes two processes. It takes your consciousness unfolding in both aspects, in your masculine and your feminine, meaning living through your emotional child and then finding who you are, and then wholeness is achieved. That's the growth stage right there. The second, which is equally important, is soul cleansing. You cannot be whole when you have obstacles to love. So this is why your self-work is so critically important. Learn to listen to your body. So many times people will ask me questions. This happened to me a couple times today. People will ask me questions and I'll say, close your eyes and say that question again. Your body told you your answer. Why did you get the knot in your stomach when you asked the question? Why did you get the knot in your neck? These memories are stored in the soul, but they're anchored in the physical body. So your body is the screen. A lot of our illnesses are actually our defense mechanisms blocking our traumas. So, for example, this one person that I was talking to, their upper back was as tight as a board. I mean, it was like that. Why? When they were radiating love. I could feel the love coming out of their chest. It's because their trauma was a betrayal of trust relating to love. So as soon as they open their hearts to give love, they close the back door to their heart and they won't receive it. Because if I allow myself to receive it, I'm going to get hurt. You might think, oh, how horrible. I stayed at the Christ in the Desert Monastery, a Benedictine monastery, for a while in northern New Mexico. And it's a very, very successful monastery, about 50 to 60 monks there. And after a week, I had a meeting with the abbot. And I said to him, you know, about a third of your monks that are here, the back door to their heart is shut. And he looked at me. I said, they think that they need to earn God's love and they're not worthy of it. They don't have to earn it. You just have to give up and allow it. There are no preconditions. But again, we take this human love. In reading souls, what I do is I'll take an illness or a pattern and I'll trace it back to a root cause. And I'll say, what caused that? What is the original perceptual programming event? And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll have a person close their eyes and just, if it's an illness, cancer or whatever, I'll have them think of where the illness is in their body. And then I'll just pick my hand up, starting about 15 feet away, and I'll walk toward them. When my hand hits the perceptual programming event, it pushes their body backwards. So, for example, I had a woman come to me and she had breast cancer. And I said, close your eyes and merely think of where the breast cancer is at. I stuck my hand up and I walked toward her and I said, your mother died 3 years ago. Why are you blaming yourself for your mother's death? And her reply was, because my mother, my Jewish mother, told me it was my job to keep her alive. Guilt, guilt, guilt. So what did she do? Self-punishment. When I touch a memory that programs cancer, MS, any autoimmune disease, that person's body, 100% of the time, will always move to the left. Now, it moves to the left, even though their eyes are closed. I'm many feet away from them, not physically touching them. I'm not saying anything. What I'm actually doing is stimulating the memory that's stored in the soul that is manifesting, anchored in the body, and is manifesting in this particular instance. What I have found is that one of the leading causes of cancer are the allosteric enzymes in the liver, which act as switches and can turn on and off the immune system, actually suppresses the immune system in a self-punishment mode. So generally, not generally, people who get angry and externalize their anger don't get cancer. Now, I was working with a woman who had breast cancer, and I said, wow. I said, you have blamed yourself for everything, and your husband guilt trips you all the time. And as I'm walking the timeline of her life, I reached into a memory and I said, and your husband cheated on you. And you got very angry at him and you exploded in anger, rightfully so. I said, but the problem is he left you. And then you beat yourself up and got angry for, you beat yourself up and created the cancer, and by blaming yourself for getting angry at him. And as I'm walking back and I'm walking through her soul, I said, there's that same pattern happened earlier in your life. You just repeated the pattern. And she said, oh, that's when I had breast cancer before. So back to the question. Finding and removing these traumas. Now, when a person closes their eyes, and I'll reach out and I'll physically take a hold of that trauma and I'll pull it and I'll try to lift it out of their soul, and they'll come forward like I have a rope tied to them. And I'll say, would you like to forgive this person? And when they say yes, it's like the rope breaks as they're letting go of that and they fly backwards. So I had a woman come to me many years ago and she said, I don't know what's wrong with me. She said, my husband has beaten me 4 times that I have been hospitalized. 4 times he has gone to jail. She said, he's getting out of prison in 2 weeks and I'm taking him back again. What's wrong with me? It's like I'm addicted to him and he keeps abusing me. I said, close your eyes and think of your husband. I'm walking up, I say, what happened involving both your mother and father when you were 3 years old? I said, very traumatic. She said, my father came home drunk and beat up my mother. And you loved your father. Yes. And you always wanted to fix your father because you loved your father. Yes. But you never could. No. Do you realize that you're using your husband as a surrogate to try to resolve your father's alcoholism? I said, let's take a look at this involving your father. So what I did is, when forgiveness is too big of a bite to swallow, I break it into 3 smaller bites. The first step is gain understanding. What was your father's childhood like? What were your grandparents, his parents like? What was the environment that he grew up in that caused him to be this way? Gain understanding. Second step, compassion. Do you realize that as a result of the anger that your father is holding on to, as a result of the experiences that he had, that he is beating himself up and he is suffering, and his anger is just an expression of the turmoil that's creating the pain inside of him? Yes, I can see that. Now that you understand him and you have compassion for him, would you like to forgive him? And I have people actually say that. Now, I have hold the memory that's the obstacle to love in their soul in my hand. if I go to pull it away and their body comes forward, that tells me their forgiveness was conditional. It wasn't unconditional. Conditional forgiveness is not forgiveness. So we must go always to the root of it, because as soon as they actually forgive it, it allows me to just lift it right out of their soul, and they'll go like, wow, I feel so much lighter. The next day she called me back and she said, what's going on? I have no love or affection or desire to be with my husband anymore. I said, because you don't need a surrogate to resolve the conflict with your father. You've healed it. So the attraction is gone. The number one attraction in relationships, this is really, really important. The number one soul attraction in relationships, what causes chemistry, that, oh, I can't live without the person. We are attracted toward individuals whose personality is similar to someone with whom we have unresolved conflict. Again, we are attracted toward individuals whose personality is similar to someone with whom we have unresolved conflict. So I was teaching a program in Scottsdale, Arizona, a couple of years ago for parents who had lost children. And it is one of the most devastating experiences that any human being can have. And as a result of this, these people were stuck in the grieving process. And this was an all-day workshop that I did. And this one woman volunteered, and she was a professional. And she said she had not been able to work for the last 2 years since her 15-year-old son was killed in a car accident. She said, I just keep crying. I'm so emotional. I can't think clearly. As I walked up to her and I walked into her memory, which was close to her body from 2 years ago, it felt like somebody was jabbing a pencil down into my heart. It hurt. As I turned around and walked away from her, all of a sudden I get this jabbing of this pencil in my heart again in the same exact place early in her childhood. I walk over to the memory and I said, to right around 3 years old, 2 to 3 years old are very, very critical years. You had that same pain in your heart. I said, take a hold of memory. What happened involving your father when you were 3 years old? She said, oh, my father abandoned our family when I was 3. I have not seen nor heard of my father since I was 3 years old. Bingo. She was grieving not for the reason she thought she was. She thought she was grieving her 15-year-old son who was killed in the accident and couldn't figure out, why can't I go through the grieving process? I'm stuck. It's because she was projecting the unresolved grief from her father that abandoned her as a young child onto her son. We go back and do the healing and remove the original trauma involving the father, the abandonment issue, the rejection, and now she is no longer projecting that onto her son, and she can go through the grieving process and heal very quickly, the son. So why am I going through these different examples? Again, it's not about me and what I can do. Anybody who transcends self can do this. Let me move to some diagrams that I have up here that are really important for people to understand. Back to wholeness. The yin yang, that represents the masculine inflow and the feminine outflow. If you're looking at the Kundalini awakening, the serpent with the 2 stakes coming up, one being masculine, one being feminine. So what happens here is your consciousness, as you grow through your life, goes through these different energy centers. So down here are your security issues, sexual issues, identity issues, heart issues, throat issues, communications issue. So this is consciousness unfolding. Guess what? Your biological clock unfolds according to the frequencies of consciousness in your soul. You ever wonder why children today go through puberty much faster than what they did 50 years ago? It's accelerated because they are exposed to the sexual energy at a much younger age. So what happens is each of these points, call it the chakras, whatever, that is the merging point of your masculine and feminine within your soul. So if we were to look at this as a body looking this way, and this being the front of the body, this being the back of the body, and we were to look at each of these energy points in the body. So when we're young children, before we go through puberty, we don't have that attraction to the opposite sex. And for the most part, we're androgynous. As soon as our consciousness starts to go through puberty, now it is taking one route or the other. And whichever route we pick, we are going to be attracted towards the complement in order to become whole at that level of consciousness. So I had mentioned the first law of attraction was we are attracted towards individuals whose personality is similar to someone we have unresolved conflict. The second law of attraction is we are attracted towards our complement, or we are attracted towards that aspect of consciousness that we are denying within ourselves. So, third level of consciousness. If you're looking at the colors of the rainbow, Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow. You ever hear the phrase, that person has a yellow streak down their back, or they have no backbone? Well, that's what happens when there's no masculine consciousness in the back right here in the governing meridian, this being the conception, if you're looking at the meridians, so that your soul is a matrix of consciousness flows, and it's growing towards wholeness. So the next step then if this is a physical body right here, and you'll notice I put a little head on there. When I come out about 15 feet from a person's body, right there is where their conception memories and their early life memories are stored. You'll notice, I think you can see them on here. This is feminine consciousness, which spins to this person's right. This is masculine consciousness, which spins to the left. So if I hold my hand up, I'm actually feeling that on both sides of my hand as I'm walking the timeline of a person's life. So what ends up happening is your memories are stored as holograms at the intersection of these two aspects of consciousness. Now, did you ever hear a person say, my life flashed before my eyes? Or they talk about the life review process after they die? All that is your conscious awareness is no longer restricted to the physical body. And as it expands beyond the physical body, it's expanding through these stored memories in the soul in reverse sequence. The strongest programming of a person's life are from conception to birth. A child in the womb cannot differentiate between their own experiences and those of the mother. I do a lot of work in the gay and lesbian community, never to judge. My whole goal is to empower people with understanding as to why they developed the pathway that they did. It doesn't matter what gender a person is. The dominant aspect of consciousness determines their gender identity. Can that change? Absolutely. It tends to androgynize the older a person gets, but the masculine and feminine personality attributes are 100% a function of the direction of travel of that consciousness that they're using. Now, when I'm standing next to a person, I actually feel their brain activity in detail in the areas of the brain. And like if a person has a stroke, I'm like a walking MRI. Now, it's not a blessing. It's as much a curse as a blessing, because it means I feel their physical and emotional pains in my body. To the extent that I'm having a bad day and I can't radiate love, I can't get rid of their pain. The only way I can get rid and stop being a psychic pincushion of everybody's experiences is to radiate love. Because if I radiate love, that love will transmute their low frequency consciousness that's causing the suffering before it reaches my body. So I can be aware of it with my consciousness, but if I don't transmute it before it hits my physical body, I physically feel it. So if someone has betrayal issues, I feel the knife in my back. If someone has a pain in the ass or a pain in the neck, I feel it. But I can also walk up to the person and say, oh, right here is where that memory is stored in your soul that your physical body is trying to block. So what ends up happening, imagine I'm trying to gouge my finger into my arm like this. Well, if it hurts, you just tighten the muscles up and now you can't penetrate. The muscles in your body do that same thing as a defense mechanism to block the stored memories on your soul from coming back in. So guess what? People who have lumbar pain, I generally find the cause is a security issue in early childhood, which is located out here in usually the first 4 years of their life. So what happens is the spinae muscles on both sides of the spine tighten up in order to put a tourniquet hold on the cell body head and the dorsal root ganglion, a tourniquet to block the transmission from the peripheral nervous system into the central nervous system. And in doing so, it compresses the disc, which creates the back pain. Well, the problem is when it compresses the spine, it also compresses the front of the spine, where the efferent sensory neurons are going to the digestive organs. So now you not only have the afferent sensory in the back blocked, but now you have digestive issues. Well, 95% of the body's serotonin, or 5-HTP, is produced in the enterochromaffin-like cells in the lining of the intestines and the stomach. But they're not going to be produced if my spine is compressed and blocking those neurons from doing their job. Now, ordinarily, those molecules of serotonin and 5-HTP are too big that they don't cross the blood-brain barrier. But guess what? When you become super stressed, the blood-brain barrier becomes super permeable. It's why a lot of people, when they're stressed, get allergies, because all of a sudden your blood-brain barrier is not filtering out all the garbage in your blood. So now a person goes to their doctor, I have back pain, I have stomach issues, and I have depression. Well, I'll give you a painkiller for your back. I'll give you a proton pump inhibitor for your stomach, a Prilosec or something, and I'll give you a SSRI, an antidepressant like Prozac, to boost your serotonin in your brain, a reuptake inhibitor. Guess what? It's not going to work. The serotonin, the SSRI is not going to work. Why? Because when there is an overall deficiency of serotonin in the body, a reuptake inhibitor is not going to substantially increase the serotonin in the synaptic cleft, so it's not going to work. I walk back and remove the trauma from the early childhood that's creating the security issue, and all of a sudden their back relaxes. Now their spine flexes out, their stomach comes back to normal functioning, their serotonin levels come up, and you don't need any medicine because you're healing the actual trauma. Had a woman had contacted me because her 17-year-old son had scoliosis so bad that her husband was sending him for surgery. And it just happened that I was traveling and able to stop at this woman's house. And when I met this young man, he looked like he was 12 years old, thin as can be, no muscle mass at all. And I talked to him a little bit, and we're in the dining room. He stands there and she goes into the kitchen. I walk back, stick my hand up. I had a memory from when he was 7 years old that it was like my hand went into a steel column. I took a hold of it and I lifted it out of his soul, and all of a sudden his back cracked so loud that the mother came running in from the kitchen. What was that? I said, well, I'm not sure, but I took a hold of this trauma from when he was 7 years old, and as soon as I removed it, his back relaxed and the scoliosis disappeared. She said, he was 7 years old when I divorced his father. So what happens is the defense mechanism of the muscles tightening up to block the emotional trauma from coming back in, then, especially during the growing stages, is going to cause the curvature of the scoliosis. Cutters, self-mutilators and cutters. Again, there's exceptions. Generally, that happens between age 2 and 3. But here's what happens. When children encounter a trauma, they blame themselves. What did I do to cause this to happen? When I discovered this, I was working with a woman and I encountered this trauma involving both her parents when she was 3 years old. And she was about 30 years old. And I said, wow, what happened when you were 3 years old involving both parents that you have been beating yourself up ever since? And she unbuttoned her sleeve and pulled it up, and it was solid razor blade scars the entire length of her arm. And I walked back and I stimulated the memory. When I stimulate the memory, it actually amplifies it and it reverse bridges it back into their mind, which incidentally, for any neuroscientists, the amygdala connects to the right spinning feminine field. The hippocampus connects to the left spinning masculine field. So that in memory storage and retrieval, it depends upon which aspect of consciousness you're in as to which interaction you're going to use between your physical body and your soul. I asked Eric Kandel, who a psychiatrist at Columbia University who got the Nobel Prize for the biochemistry of memory storage. I said, so where are these memories stored? Well, in the synapses of the brain. Oh, okay. I actually asked Joe Ledoux, who wrote the textbook that's used in medical schools and neuroscience for the storage of memories. Where are memories stored? In the synapses of the brain. Your memories are no more stored in the synapses of the brain than the music you hear coming out of the radio is stored in the radio. Your brain is merely a transmitter and a receiver communicating with your soul. When I first discovered this, it freaked me out. Back in the early 90s. And as part of learning how consciousness works, I decided I needed to learn hypnosis. And this woman came to me, and I had just learned it. This was probably session number 2. It was right in the beginning. And this woman came to me, and she was an emergency room nurse in the hospital. And she had severe pain in her left shoulder and her left arm, to the point where in her mid-30s, she was going on disability. She couldn't work anymore. It was idiopathic. They couldn't figure out what the cause was, but they figured it was, after all their tests, it was some sort of an arthritic pain. Now, ordinarily, I wouldn't have used hypnosis to block pain, because what if there's a tumor or something? Pain is a symptom. You have to find the cause. You don't just block it. But anyway, she had the letter from her doctor saying it was okay to use hypnosis for pain management. She was somnambulistic and went into a deep trance. And all I said to her was, if that pain in your shoulder could speak, what would it say? A male voice answered me out of her mouth and said, "Get out of here." I'm like, whoa, who said that? And this guy tells me his name. I said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I was killed in a car accident in South Williamsport on Route 15, right in front of McDonald's on the corner in the highway. And I followed my body in the ambulance into the hospital emergency room, where I saw her in distress, and I moved in." Prior to this, I didn't believe in ghosts. I didn't believe in spirits. I didn't believe in any of this stuff. This was totally new to me. So I said to him, in the interim, he tells me his name, his address, his phone number, his children's name. I am talking to this man. That his soul is using her vocals. And I said, "What caused your physical death?" He said, "I was thrown out of the car and it rolled on me." I said, what part of your body?" He said, "The left side." All of a sudden, I realized his memory of the pain from the accident that caused his death was still with his soul, because it didn't go to the higher level of consciousness to be cleansed. So when he moved into her and attached to her and had been there for 2 years, his memory of his physical pain was manifesting in her body and creating her disability. That was the very first time that I realized memories are not stored in the physical body, because this guy didn't have a physical body, but yet he's still talking to me, and his pain's manifesting in her. So I said to him, "Why are you in her?" He said, "I love her." I said, "If you loved her, why are you causing her all this pain and suffering?" He said, "I didn't know that I was causing her the pain and suffering." "But you know it now." "Yes." "You realize you're going to have to leave?" "Yes." "Before you leave, would you like to apologize to her for all the pain and suffering you've caused her?" "Yes." And he starts apologizing. I turn to her and say, "Will you accept his apology?" And she says, "Yes." All of a sudden, her left arm flies up in the air like this. Her hand opens up, comes down limp. Guess what? Her pain was gone permanently. It wasn't her pain. It manifested in her body. There is far more of that going on than what people are aware of. Once you raise your consciousness, remember, Jesus said in John 14, he said, "The things that I do and even more, you too shall do." The problem is Christians treat Jesus like he's a lifeguard, and he can pluck them out when they're drowning or rescue them when they die. And while he has that ability, which would you sooner have? A lifeguard that waits until you're drowning to pluck you out of the water, or a lifeguard that teaches you how to swim? Jesus was a rabbi. He was teaching people the same thing that I'm sharing with you right now. It's just that I'm sharing a little more of the mechanics, where he talked about humility and pride and all these other attributes. Now, I have to watch my time, because I have a list of symptoms and different attributes, and I only have about 10 minutes before the break. I'm going to stretch it a little bit if that's okay, Smith. You notice this green ring right here where I have a double ring. When I'm standing in a person's conception memory, if I take a half step back, all of a sudden there's this unbelievable elation. You ever hear of people who do regression to source or meditation to source? And they say, you're going to go back until before you came into this body. That's exactly what that ring is. Those are the memories that are stored in your soul when your soul was still at the higher level with divine before it came down and manifested in the physical body. And when I step into those, there's one other thing that happens that's really unusual when I step into that. It doesn't happen all the time. But when I step in that and a person's standing there with their eyes closed, if I bend my body to the side or forward, their body does the same thing I do because I'm connected to their higher consciousness by standing in that ring. When I first discovered this, it freaked me out. So I stood on one leg and took my other foot and scratched the back of my left leg with my right foot and toes. And guess what? The person standing there with their eyes closed did the same exact thing. When you connect to the higher consciousness, we are all one. Now, you notice that there's another ring out here. Guess what? If I take another half step outside of where that ring is at, where a person is connected to heaven, I'm in their death experience of their last life. I don't care if a person doesn't believe in reincarnation. I did. But it's as real can be. All the memories of every life you have ever lived are right there in your soul in reverse sequence. So if I'm out about 30 feet, guess what? There's the conception memories from your previous life. When I step back a little bit further, I'm in the death experience of the life before that. It's just like growth rings on a tree. I didn't understand it in Autobiography of a Yogi when I first read it. And I didn't realize that Paramahansa Yogananda was talking about Swami Ramakrishna, who made this statement, or this statement was about him. It was, here comes a man whose soul is like a lake, meaning very big. He's followed by a man whose soul is like an ocean. So in other words, as your soul is growing and growing, and it's creating all these growth rings, it keeps getting bigger and bigger, and it increases your chances of connecting with the divine. Now, we are in very special times right now. We are in special times where soul growth is so accelerated because of higher consciousness. Many people who meditate can see the light. In fact, just as I'm mentioning this, I can feel it. There's people that are listening to this that I can feel the tingling on the top of their head right now. That is higher consciousness moving in. And as a result, a young soul can catch up to an old soul in one lifetime. The opportunities that are available to us now have never been available to us before. We are in wonderful times. So back to my example about Ramakrishna, when Paramahansa Yogananda was talking about him, he was talking about the soul that was an ocean. I've been as far as 300 feet away from a person and reached out and touched their stored memories that knocked them off the feet. And their eyes are closed. Do you know what one of the most profound memories that I see carried from one life to another? Women who died in childbirth. The amount of fear because so many women died in childbirth, the amount of fear relating to having children that was carried forward from many generations. Now, there is also intergenerational trauma. Remember, I said that if a child in the womb could not differentiate between their mother's experiences and their own. So I had a woman in her early 60s come to me and she said, I have such severe anxiety, I can't work. Can you help me? I don't know. I walked back, stick my hand up. I stepped into a memory. Wow, the anxiety was through the roof. I said, whoa, your mother was a professional person. And when she was pregnant with you, she was wrestling with, how am I going to handle being a mother and also handle my job? And this created so much anxiety that the child in the womb was experiencing this anxiety. At the same time, I walked forward and I said, when you were in your late 20s, you experienced this anxiety again. She said, that's when I was in my 3rd year of medical residency, and that's when I was pregnant with my daughter. I said, boom. I said, and your daughter has the anxiety in her because you experienced it, just as you have it because your mother experienced it. She said, now I know why I have all this anxiety. She said, that daughter, who was my firstborn, lives out of the country, and she came to visit me for 2 weeks ago, and she's still here, and she is pregnant with her first child. 4 generations of programming of a pattern that passes. Now, forget the guilt, forget the blame. No matter what, no mothers should carry guilt. Why? Your child chose to be born to you in order to have the life experiences that are the exact ones that are unfolding in their life, just as you chose your parents. About 4 years ago, I was working with a young woman with Down syndrome. And here's what was unusual. This whole section right here above her right ear, she had all of her hair plucked out, no hair whatsoever. I'm sitting at the dinner table next to her, and I looked over and I said, those voices are annoying, aren't they? When people are psychic or in schizophrenics, or in this case, she had Down syndrome, when people hear voices, I actually see and feel them and hear them coming into the right temporal parietal junction. Or if someone is psychic and they're channeling, I can actually connect to their voices that are coming into this right temporal parietal junction. Well, what was happening was this Down syndrome woman didn't want those voices, and she kept pulling them out by pulling her hair out. So she had a very large area with no hair. And none of the doctors could figure out why she couldn't, went through all the treatments, couldn't stop her from pulling her hair. She was trying to pull the voices out. But I had this woman's mother, who was in her mid-70s, stand along the wall. And I took this 38-year-old daughter with Down syndrome, and I am walking her through her mother's stored memories in her soul. When I got the daughter in this ring right here, before the mother came down into the grandmother, all of a sudden, this woman with Down syndrome yells out, wow! The room just filled with love, like a fire hose of love. And the mother, who's standing against the wall, is falling over forward. The attraction is that strong. And I said, it is very evident that you two agreed that she would be your daughter before you, the mother, were even conceived. This happens a lot. The roadmap of soul growth. We're going to spend about 7 minutes on this. We all begin in dependency. You rely on your parents to change your diaper, to feed you, to shelter you. As you grow, that dependency decreases. Remember, I mentioned earlier at around age 7 to 8, you then begin to, this is the feminine or the emotional child, you then develop the masculine. Validation is what creates a healthy individual or a healthy ego. This is the self-actualization. This period right here, I call the teenage transition. This is that in-between period. If you can imagine a teenager's consciousness, I could do a whole workshop, a whole day just on this one subject of the transition and what causes the instability, what causes peer pressure. When I feel people's consciousness as they're going through this transition, it has the turbulence of the ocean on a choppy day, the waves, and it's all over the place. So what happens is, right in here, for example, is what I call the hire the 16-year-old while they still know it all stage. All that is when they're coming out of the teenage transition and they put their toe on the threshold of a self-identity, there's a period of euphoria. Guess what? That same thing happens when a person goes through the dark night of the soul and puts their toe on the threshold of a transcendent experience or a God experience for the first time, and they think they know it all, when in actuality, they've merely put their toe on the threshold. But the profound experience, they'll come back and they'll want to write books and they want to tell everybody, you know, I have the answers, follow me. What actually happens is they end up circling back and creating a spiritual ego. And they actually lose the benefit of their profound experience because they claim the experience as an ego possession rather than learning from it and growing. Right here is midlife crisis. Right there is the dark night of the soul. You have 4 options when you're going through a midlife crisis. Most people use option 1, which is to circle back the affairs, the sports cars. What can I do to revalidate me so I can feel good about me again? Option 2, some people, I can't take this anymore, I'm out of here, and they just give up and die. They do it either through an illness or suicide, but they say, this is it, I'm out of here. The closer you get to the dark night of the soul experience, the scarier it is. So much so that when you're approaching this area right in here, there is a tendency to circle back and surrender externally your will to someone else. That is exactly what happened during this whole COVID vaccine thing. I'm not arguing right or wrong, good or bad, but the psychological aspect of it was a fear that caused people to lose discernment and surrender their individual authority to a person. That is exactly what is going to happen right now as a result of this turmoil. People are becoming emotional and irrational, and they are going to clamp onto a leader that is leading them astray. Your guru is not external to you. The difference between the fake born again process and the real born again process is, in the fake process, people are surrendering external to another human being. Never, ever, ever, not to me, not to anyone, do not surrender your will externally. You can share it in a relationship and work with people. But if you surrender it externally to someone else, it's not available for you to surrender to a higher level of consciousness within you. So what happens when you go through this dark night of the soul, that's the fourth option. You go through the dark night of the soul and you go into transcendence. And what will happen is your empathy will be through the roof. You'll start to feel, I was in a restaurant having lunch and my legs are hurting so bad that it's bringing tears to my eyes. And I look at the next table and there sits a guy who's double amputee and I'm feeling his phantom leg pain. You start to pick up on everything. You can call it born again, because just as when you're born from your mother's womb and you're seeing for the first time and hearing and feeling and smelling and tasting, and you have to learn how to use these senses and then learn your reality, that same thing happens again when you go through transcendence, because now you're beginning to perceive directly from your consciousness external to your physical body. And once you've done that, it blew me away that I was working with a person who I had never met who was in Europe. And they called me on the phone, and it was one of my very first video calls ever. And I said, take your phone and set it on the table diagonal in front of you and walk back about 10 feet and close your eyes. And I reached out and I touched the memory, and I'm in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and they're in Europe, probably, I don't know, 4,000 or 5,000 miles away. And it knocked them off their feet 3 times. And from that, I was able to say to them, and I'm not going to disclose it, what it was, but I was able to tell them what their trauma was that caused their self-esteem issues throughout their entire life. So once you connect to higher consciousness in transcendence, there is no limit. And it's like connecting to the World Wide Web. Everyone on earth is connected to you. So transcendence is the key, but you can't transcend self during this period right here. And they've actually shown with EEGs that there is a period of integration. And you'll actually, let's talk about the symptoms for 5 minutes. You'll actually feel like a rubber swim cap is being pulled onto your head. And what that is your consciousness rewiring itself. And what they found is with EEGs, during this dark night of the soul and transcendent experience, that your beta frequencies, which are your analytical prefrontal cortex neurons, start to synchronize with your theta frequencies, which are your emotional child. What happens? Your beta frequency, when you're in the physical body, you are generally limited to 30 to 40 hertz. Incidentally, 30 hertz, you participate in your dreams. At 40 hertz, it's a lucid dream, and you're the director, script writer, participant. As you get into these higher states, you begin to fully participate in your dreams in a conscious aware state. Once you go above 40 hertz is the brainwave frequency that is necessary for transcendence to begin. What happens is you have these neurons in your brain, they're called pyramidal neurons, and they're actually like trees with root systems and branches that go out. And those are what begin firing at these higher rates. And you will actually physically feel the energy changes around your brain as you begin to perceive your consciousness. At the same time, other people say, what's that light I see around your head? Remember what I said earlier, higher levels of consciousness generate light. So the light, the other attributes, first, there's many, many levels of transcendence. And where you're at today may not be where you're at tomorrow, and you may be back down to the lower spot the day after that. It's a roller coaster, which one of the number one symptom of a spiritual awakening is very similar to bipolar or manic depression. Why? It's part of the cleansing process of finding and removing the obstacles to love in your soul. I can assure you, after you're doing it for a while, it gets to the point where the deeper into the doldrums you go, you begin to say, wow, I'm really going to go high when I come out of this. It's like jumping on a trampoline. The deeper you go when you're going down, the higher you go when you go up. And what you find is, as you're doing more and more cleansing work, that you start spending more time. You have control over your consciousness. Number one tool for spiritual growth, I'll put two of them into one category, prayer and meditation. Don't let your environment control the frequency of your consciousness. I do a finger pointing demonstration quite often where I point my finger in a person's face and say, how does that make you feel? And they'll say, oh, I feel threatened, get it out of here, or I want to bite it, or I want to hit you. I'll say, close your eyes and say a prayer. And when they open their eyes, I'll point my finger again. How's that make you feel? Doesn't bother me. Say, exactly. All you did in that prayer was you tuned your consciousness to a higher level. You can tune your consciousness so low that molehills appear as mountains, or you can tune it so high that you're above the clouds and mountains appear as molehills. Bottom line, you have control over the operational frequency of your consciousness. That's the goal of meditation. Prayer is a tool within meditation. Learn to raise it. The other symptoms that you run into very quickly, you'll have aches and pains. Some people, when they have a Kundalini awakening, which is when a Kundalini awakening is when a higher consciousness moves into you and accelerates your process. You have to be very careful when this happens. It won't kill you, but it can make you want to die. For example, if you have the Kundalini energy is flowing on a vertical axis, if all of a sudden you spill your consciousness out horizontally, let's say sexually. I've had more than one person that I helped that could not walk as a result of the paralysis that set in from the waist down as a result of blowing their chakra. And I'll just help them patch it back up and lift their consciousness and put it back on a vertical axis again. But think of it as, if you want the water to go up a straw, you can't have a hole in the side of it. If you want your consciousness to go to a higher level within you, you can't allow it to spill out horizontally. The throbbing sensations. At one point, the top of my head, it felt like somebody put a metal ring on it and smacked it with a hammer, and it had lumps that were physical lumps in my skull that were tender to the touch. All that was an etheric cleansing taking place. Do not allow fear to come in. This is where meditation and internal guidance, the shaking. You know, there's a reason why the Quakers are called the Quakers and the Shakers the Shakers. When higher consciousness moves into you and it's cleansing your soul, you begin to shake. It's kind of like a dog that just got out of the pond and wants to get rid of their water. It's on them. So you'll Yeah, that was funny. So the shaking, the ringing in the ears, incidentally, learn to use that ringing in your ears, because what you'll find is that you can use it as an altimeter in meditation to know what frequency of consciousness you're at. Because what you'll find is, as you go higher in consciousness frequency, the pitch will change of the ringing in your ears. So you can actually use that ringing like an altimeter. Headaches. As these cleansing things are taking place, headaches are normal. Waking up at 3 a.m., insomnia, it's normal. But don't worry, utilize that time. Now, why is 3 a.m. a magic hour? That's because everyone else's consciousness is shut down. So it's like, which would you sooner do? Take off in an airport in O'Hare when there's 1,000 airplanes around you trying to land and take off, or to take off when there's no traffic? Well, guess what? It's the same way in meditation. If you're meditating when the consciousness traffic is low, it's much easier for you to tap into the higher levels. The depression and anxiety are normal parts. Incidentally, depression is attachment to the past. People in teenage transition will experience depression because they're attached to whomever it is in a dependency. People in midlife crisis will go through depression because they're attached to their ego identity. Anxiety, unlike depression, which is attachment to the past, anxiety is worried about the future. So be in the moment. Mindfulness is the middle road. Now, why is mindfulness so critically important? It is because mindfulness is where you are shifting your consciousness from a horizontal axis of attached to the past or worried about the future. And now, because you're not doing that, you can shift it to a vertical axis to a higher level. I see these things. I feel consciousness. I see it. What I'm describing to you, in fact, Suzanne Diesman was using one of the techniques I showed her, where I actually just take a hold of people's ego, which comes right through the chest, and I'll spin it from a horizontal axis to a vertical axis. And I'm like, wow, I'm feeling wonderful all of a sudden. What's going on? Well, it's temporary, but the more you do it, the more it becomes permanent. The separation, the getting fed up with jobs, with relationships, things that are unhealthy. As you go through a spiritual awakening, you will find that you just can't be around those things. Your consciousness moves you in the direction in your life that you need to be. You generally see through illusions with your heightened intuition. If people are fake or phony and putting on a facade, you see right through it. Again, that's a natural attribute. When I went through this stuff, there was no one. There were no books on it. Stan Grof's wife had gone through it, and before she died, and he wrote on some of this along with her, but there was nothing. And I learned from the School of Hard Knocks, and there's a reason why the class colors for that school are black and blue, because you learn some difficult experiences. What I'm sharing with you is a knowledge for you to use. This roadmap is absolutely critical, because if you know what lies ahead, you're not going to circle back when you hit a tough period. The last thing is the chronic fatigue and so forth. I had unbelievable chronic fatigue as I was going through this, and I couldn't figure out why I was so tired. Many things come into that, but it's all part of basically your garbage coming to the surface. You'll also notice that you get hot, almost like, the joke, it's not menopause, these are power surges. They really are power surges when you're going through a spiritual awakening. The heat is caused by the transformation process of high consciousness burning your garbage off. If you could actually see this, it looks like one of those electronic bug zappers when a moth flies into it and the flames fly and the smoke and it's transformed. That same thing, it's like putting a dense object in the high frequency of a microwave. It heats up. Incidentally, the majority of global warming is people who are holding on to physical things as higher consciousness is coming in. That is hell. Hell is trying to approach higher consciousness while you're holding on to your garbage. So there's a saying in the Bible that's very true. A prayerful blessing to an evil person is like putting hot coals on your head, on their head. You'll find that if you're radiating love, evil people can't even stand close to you. I think that's it.
I think so. We're going to wrap it up, not because we couldn't go on and on, but we've had, it's 9:30, and I think other folks may want to head home. And we want to thank you for being our speaker tonight, Lee. Everybody give him a hand, and hope we can see you and hear from you again soon.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.